Hello, everyone. This is Nayiri from Low Carb and Fasting. Our guest today is a doctor of physics. Well, in fact, he has PhD in theoretical and mathematical physics. He's a researcher of type 1 diabetes as a disease, but also its management, because his son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at age 9. He's an advocate of Dr. Richard Bernstein's type 1 diabetes management protocol. Well, in fact, if you haven't read Dr. Bernstein's diabetes solution, I recommend that you buy the book and read it over and over again. I've been using it as reference book for years now. And also, he produces Dr. Bernstein's Diabetes University podcast. Again, I will put his channel link below so you can follow Dr. Bernstein's Diabetes University podcast on YouTube. Richard, David, Dikeman, welcome to Low Carb and Fasting.
Okay, it's great to be here. I'm part of a pretty impressive group of people that you've been interviewing, so it's quite an honor to be amongst those people.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, the honor is mine. I'm actually interested in how a physicist became interested in nutrition and diet and disease management.
Yeah.
So because you wouldn't have, you didn't know much about nutrition and diet, right? You probably didn't even know about type 1 diabetes as a disease before your son was diagnosed. So let's go to the very beginnings. Tell us the story of how your son David was diagnosed and how you discovered Dr. Bernstein. I think it was your wife, right? Take us to the beginnings.
Yeah, you're right about the lack of overlap between theoretical physics and good nutrition. I think when I was at the height of my theoretical physics powers and production, I was eating the most pizza and drinking the most beer that I had, and was not particularly in good shape, but just surviving because I was in my 20s, when you're sort of invincible to these metabolic problems to some degree. So there was no overlap. In fact, it's interesting because we're going to talk about your question, which is, what happened when Dave was diagnosed. But I'm a good person to think about when you think about all these things we know now about the food pyramid guidelines and the obesity crisis, and something's wrong. And why are they telling people to eat 11 servings of grains a day? And cholesterol isn't really the primary cardiovascular risk factor. All those things. Of course, I'm an intelligent, well-read person. So you read little bits on this stuff. And I've read enough to go, I just, even though I'm a physicist, I believed hook, line, and sinker that cholesterol clogs your arteries and we should stay away from red meat. And I was very good about eating my skim milk and cereal and doing all those stupid things that if you could really go back and fix. I wish I could talk to myself for about a minute. So that was kind of my orientation. And, I graduated with my PhD and I moved to a different city and I got married and I had kids, and those things stayed with me. I never changed. The kids' diets when they were little was very, very food pyramid-y. Of course, you really can't follow the food pyramid because it's sort of an impossible task to follow. So you sort of rely heavily on the ultra processed foods to try to complete that food pyramid guideline, and you remove a lot of the stuff that you should be eating. But anyway, that's the orientation up to the point where Dave was diagnosed. The kids were eating blueberry muffins for breakfast and drinking juice, and I felt a little guilty giving him high fat milk, so we would only give him 1%, and maybe eggs on the weekend only, and just birthday cake galore. That was another interesting thing when you have kids today. You just see the amount of junk food is just like if when we were kids, if some mom would have brought in cupcakes or birthday cake for somebody's birthday, it would have been like a riot. And now it's like every single day there's somebody, you have a class of 25 kids, there's 25 birthdays, and if the kid's birthday is in July or on Sunday, the parents make sure that they still celebrate it, in January, and the parents are always there eating along with the kids. And so that's kind of like the environment that we lived in. And I think that's an important thing to talk about, because if you look at me and you go, oh, well, he's, some kind of nutrition, dude, it isn't the truth. I was just a happy-go-lucky, pizza eating, French fry eating, beer drinking slob from the Midwest. And about the time Dave was diagnosed, how old am I? Well, let's not even figure that out. That's a difficult calculation. But I was old enough that I was pretty heavy, somewhere in the range of 260 pounds at my heaviest. And then Dave got diagnosed, and everything changed.
So who found out about Bernstein? Because you wouldn't have heard Bernstein's name at the hospital, right? I mean, they didn't
Right.
talk about Bernstein or Bernstein's certain management strategies, right?
So
They
it's
talked about it.
It's really interesting, the misinformation that you're given when your son or your daughter are diagnosed is immediate. And I'll give you just one example. We can go on and on. The first thing that you're taught when your child is diagnosed, and Dave was diagnosed in a severe state of DKA, he was near death. It's an awful story. But when he was diagnosed, you're taught carb counting. And you think, well, like, why are we following carb counting? So you initially question the method, perhaps, because you can learn about the dangers of high blood sugar right away. And it's never taught that for example, protein foods require insulin, which is like a well-known physiologic fact, right? Everybody knows why and we can get to that later. But the main point is, if you don't know that, you think the following logic: the kids need carbohydrate because they need insulin. So we have to feed carbohydrate. Not only is it the food pyramid recommendation, and the kids are at cardiometabolic risk because they're a type 1, but they need insulin to grow. So I need to provoke the need for insulin by feeding my child carbohydrate. So that's a myth. But you immediately get wrapped around myths like that, and you get thrown into that world. And so we left the hospital, and we tried for a month to follow along with these guidelines. And I, as a physicist, tried to exactly match the carbohydrate with the insulin. And this is the other thing about carb counting that they don't teach you. They don't teach you that it's impossible to match fast-acting carbohydrate injections with, or fast-acting insulin with rapid-acting carbohydrate. You can't. Why would you even expect that you could match those two things with the variability in digestion? It's like pulling a slot machine handle and expecting to win. There's too much variation in the system. And the fact that nobody can do it is a clue that it doesn't work. But the takeaway by the care providers and the the doctors is that, well, your ratios are off, or you're just not very good at it, but they all believe that the method works, even though there's no examples in their own practices or in the literature where it works. Well, we figured that out right away. In a couple of weeks, I figured out using, taking data and trying this exact same meal and seeing this variation in results. And I also learned that the elevated blood sugars are a real problem. So, the sad thing now about the medical community is that instead of teaching people that this carb counting doesn't work, they're sticking with the carb counting, and then they're inflating the range that they call time and range, and they're giving people a false sense of security about the blood sugars. So it's diabolical what's happening, but we didn't fall for it. And during the month or so when I sort of proved that this couldn't be done, my wife got, as you mentioned earlier, she ordered the Bernstein book, and I went back once and looked, when did we order that book? And it was a month after diagnosis she ordered the book. And apologies if you've heard this story before, but damn it, I've got that book. I opened it up and started reading it, and I just knew that we had found the solution to the problem. And it was like, it's like I feel like I'm in therapy every time I talk about that, because that was such a traumatic thing to see your child go through, and then to find the solution to it. It was like a remarkable experience. One of the most, and of course, once you start doing it, there's like an instant improvement. It doesn't take months for the system to sort of break in or something like that. The closer you follow along with it, the faster you're going to get. We were doing things like, we were seeing blood sugars, like I remember seeing a blood sugar of 270, 280, and then you would check, and then it'd be 320. And then you would try to give insulin, and then it would be back down to 120. And you'd be like, oh my God, right? And then you would check 10 minutes later and be 65. And this is before CGMs too. I mean, what a nightmare that experience is. And then if you switch to, bacon and eggs, oh, he's 120. Oh, okay. Oh, he's 72. Okay.
I've lived that experience, sad experience, for decades. For decades. I've lived that for decades. And I thought I was to blame because I wasn't being smart enough. In fact, I was told that I wasn't being smart enough with my pump, that I should pre-bolus, or I should try different ratios.
Pre-bolus, it doesn't work.
Or pre-bolus, or maybe, not 15 minutes, or maybe I should pre-bolus 20 minutes earlier. And no one ever told me, don't eat that freaking pizza. I mean, I would have been happy not to eat it. I would have been more than, happy not to ever touch bread, but no one ever told me. And I kept trying and counting carbohydrates and trying that futile sort of mission of trying to match insulin to the conversion of your food into glucose. I mean, how do you even match that? That is an impossible task. Right. I think I had my light bulb moment when I heard that very, very statement from one of Bernstein's early videos, where he clearly said it is a very difficult, in fact, it's almost an impossible task to match those two sort of curves, if you like. And then I just thought, this is it. There's nothing wrong with me or my efforts. I'm not a failure. It's just what I've been taught is not. They
tell the care providers to give the diabetics this huge range. The time in range is now, we'll talk about that because there's news on that. There's a range which is, they allow up to 180, and then 30% of the time you can be above that. And one of the reasons they give is because you don't want to make people feel like a failure. Yet they force the same strategy on everybody, which doesn't work at all. It is a mathematically guaranteed strategy which will fail. It just defies comprehension that this vast industry of people would force people like you and my son to follow a protocol which is so failed, and then be totally uninterested in an alternative method which yields unprecedented glycemic results and improvement in quality of life. And the trick to doing so is to use insulin in a safer way and essentially get rid of processed junk food. Those are the two things that really are, because people aren't just like giving up sweet potatoes. Okay, what you have to do to convert the Bernstein protocol is to give up all the addictive, obesogenic, industrial processed foods that people are addicted to. And if you can do that, you're home free. So why would there be so much pushback from this diabolical diabetes industry to giving up junk food and using insulin in a safer way to achieve results which remove you from being in a situation where you're going to die early with significant agony when your blood sugar's up here, to living a long, healthy life down here? You would think, like, we published this paper with this group from Type 1 Grit. And it got coverage in the New York Times. You would think that the entire diabetes industry would stop. They would invite people who participated in the study to frequently talk at their conferences, that on and on and on. Instead, the reaction is the opposite. If you're a low carb type 1 diabetic, you're persona non grata in the diabetes industry community. And that's what I call it. They don't want to have any of their paid diabetes advocates be low carb. They don't have any physicians who are interested in it. There's no follow-up research on it. Instead, they are concerned with giving each other awards, showing that their equipment can lower A1C by like 0.3% or some garbage result like that. Bragging about their new loops. And if you read the fine print, the loops are well, the loop is a great thing, okay, but your glycemic results without changing your diet on the loop are still a big problem. It's still the food, and yet everyone ignores the fact that it's the food. And as a physicist, how could you do that? That's the main governor of the whole system, is how fast your food turns into glucose.
Yeah, I completely sympathize with it. That you just said.
If they were here with us right now, what do you think they would say to that? I mean, what could you possibly say to that argument?
I think we have to look at. They can't argue it. There's just they can't possibly argue it. But I think we have to look at who's.
Well, they would say,
who's funding.
sometimes they say,
funding
like,
the ADA and who's funding our Diabetes UK, which is our equivalent of the American ADA, right? The Diabetes UK.
I think they try to make the argument that we need to have more studies, but there's no good studies that show their methods work. So that's one thing. And then they rely on, then they start saying weird things like, well, if you get rid of all that processed obesogenic junk food, which we know is responsible for, all the type 2 diabetes in the world. And in fact, we see now type 2 diabetes amongst all the type 1 kids. And we know that the child obesity rates are off the chart, and they're worse with the type 1s. But they say if you remove that addictive processed food, which we now know is a main chief source of eating disorders, and they say if you remove that food, you're going to cause an eating disorder. And I say, if you're if you think removing the junk food is going to cause you a disorder, it might be that the disorder is upon you already. Because once you get rid of that food, it's like breaking an addiction. We don't tell people who smoke that you need to keep smoking or else you'll get addicted to smoking. And we don't tell people who are drinking too much that they need to keep drinking a bit here and there or else they'll become an alcoholic. It's nonsense. So you can't tell someone who's a diabetic, a type 2 diabetic, or someone with weight problems, or someone who's being negatively affected by this processed food, that they should keep eating it when we know that it's driving disorders. So they don't really have any arguments anymore. Now, I'll tell you one thing. I've been watching. We're talking about time and range. I watched a conference via Twitter this weekend, and I saw something very interesting, because when this time and range stuff came out, they allow up to 180. If you go into the
180 for people using our UK menu.
Yes, 10 millimoles. Yes. So 180 or 10, that's a range, and they try to convince you that's a safe range. So that means, like, if you're a parent and your child is sleeping and they go to bed, it's 11 o'clock, and you check on them and they're 160, let's say, they're in range. Well, that range is double normal. And if you read literature, and I'm not talking about Dr. Bernstein's literature, I'm talking about ADA published literature. You read about the dangers of those blood sugars. There are microvascular dangers and there are macrovascular dangers. You don't get a free pass to health by running a blood sugar, which is double normal and 30% above that. And they're starting to recognize that. So now they've got a new phrase that they trotted out this weekend. I had never heard it before. I don't know who's responsible for it. It's called time in titer range. And now they're defining that as up to 140. And you read the papers that they're talking about, there's little sentences here and there that, you got to be careful of, because non-diabetics are not running over 140. They have some references and so on. So I thought, well, we should have a new phrase called time in normal range, which is like, I don't know, let's say it's 75 to 100. Okay. That's a pretty reasonable range. If you're following the Bernstein method and you're up above 110, depends on the context, but you're likely to, if you're really good at it, you're likely to correct that 110. You're not going to be walking around at 110. And if you're rising at 110, you're going to go, okay, I might be 120 in a half an hour. So I'm going to take a half a unit of insulin. And that's the control the Bernstein method provides for you. But they can never give people advice like that who are following their same advice to eat all the birthday cake they want and so on. Because if you do that, 110 is as good as it's going to get, right? So anyway, that's the new thing, time and titer range. You're going to hear more about that, and they're going to throw their hands up and say, well, like we time and range is sort of reasonable, and but we do tell people if you can get in time and titer range, that's a good thing. And it's like, okay, at some point you have to tell people how to do that, right? Let's get curious about how other people are doing it. And the lack of curiosity is what I'm talking about. Why are these people so incurious and so quick to write off this method? And it's like, what do these people do in their like normal lives? When do they constantly like hit their heads against the wall, and anything in their life that doesn't work, do they not respond to any stimulus that could change things in a positive direction? I mean, it's like the whole thing is so bizarre, right? I say, diabetes, like once we got the book, I kind of figured out diabetes in about 2 weeks. But the real bizarre problem is trying to understand this industry that keeps insisting, from my vantage point, on sending people down the tubes over and over again. In fact, if you follow this method, you're likely to get harassed and threatened by your care team. It's a fact. People will get fired for eating healthy meals of protein foods and vegetables using safe dosing of insulin and achieving glycemic results that no other patient in the practices shoot for. And for that, you'll get harassed, threatened, and maybe fired by your care provider. It's just unbelievable.
That lack of
Rant.
understanding is the same in the UK. I mean, even I've been doing low carb now for 8 years. And even as recently as a few months ago, I went to my GP to have, my annual sort of checkup. And I worried about telling them I'm on a carnivore, sort of protein-rich carnivore with small amounts of vegetables here and there. That's sort of a diet. And I thought, I won't mention that. They won't understand it. And so I told my GP I'm on a ketogenic diet. And you're assuming, I mean, that's more sort of accepted and more mainstream, especially with a keto diet and, the successes of type 2 diabetics putting their condition into remission.
Yes.
And his response was, oh no, keto is not suitable for type 1s. And I said, nonsense. Have you read Dr. Bernstein's book? And I probably insulted him, but I was just so offended by that sort of rant.
How could you spend, so if you're a physician, you're a sufficiently erudite person, how can you spend your whole life, Monday through Friday, 40 hours a week or more, treating people with type 1 diabetes, but be so utterly lacking of understanding even basic things about the condition, and then have hubris on top of it? So it's like the psychology is fascinating. Like how could such a person operate in real life? I don't understand it. And from a physicist's perspective, I have to say that, in my job, I'm wrong. If I'm not wrong, let's say once a day, then I'm not doing my job and I'm not moving forward. And what does that look like? It means, like, let's suppose I'm working on a technical problem and I'm writing some computer code to do some analysis. What do I do when I'm writing the code? I don't write the code and then say it's correct. I run the code and then I look at it and then I say, oh, like the line is the line has to start at 0 and it's starting at 1. So my function's wrong. So I need a new term to add it. So then I add a new term. So it's constant trial and error. Okay. But with the doctors, there's no feedback. There's no interest in that feedback loop. Like, don't you wonder why all your patients are going to crap? Why are they running blood sugars, which are, let's say average A1C is around 8%. Well, I was talking about the fact that the doctors, there's no feedback loop in the doctor's system. So they have patients, they have their cohort, they're achieving poor glycemic control, but they never try to improve that. They never look at the people who are doing well and say to themselves, what are they doing differently? And even if they recognize that the low carb is doing something, they just write it off and say, well, none of my other patients will ever follow that, so I'm not even going to bother, right? But you would still, if you were, like, I guess, an honest intellectual, wouldn't you be interested in, like, well, what are they doing, right? And are they taking like, let's suppose they have a meal with, let's just suppose, like, Dave goes out with his friends and he eats a double cheeseburger, doesn't eat any carbs, just the cheeseburger, and just no bun, no fries, no vegetables. Like, does he take insulin for that? That's an interesting question. And the answer is, yeah, he takes a lot of insulin for that. And then the next question would be, okay, why does he take insulin for that? Right. And then, but more myths are going to arise when you start asking these questions. Even the low carb community doesn't get all these questions correct. But you should at least be interested enough to follow along. But the doctors just don't. They just cut the cord and they say, I'm not going to think about this. I've been told that carb counting, and it doesn't work for anybody. I don't know any of my friends who have patients that it works for. But I'm going to keep pushing that for my entire career and send all my patients down the tubes. what kind of, what, it's just an absolute mad world. This type 1 diabetes industry, it's total madness.
Earlier on you mentioned the complications of poorly controlled, we have to emphasize that, complications of poorly controlled type 1 diabetes, because we keep hearing no one ever differentiates between a well-controlled type 1 sort of diabetes and poorly controlled, but differences are huge. So let's talk about some of the complications that you're aware of badly or poorly controlled type 1 diabetes, especially if you're running your blood sugars constantly at levels above 7 or at 10. In fact, a small anecdote: the other day I woke up really feeling like hot and uncomfortable and sweaty in the middle of the night. My alarm didn't ring. I wear a CGM. My alarm didn't ring, and my blood sugar was 10, which is 180. That was not normal. My body, that's just so not normal for my body. And I had a pod. I wear the Omnipod. I had the cannula or something, so I had a pump failure. But at that level, because I'm so accustomed to normal levels or lower levels.
Yeah.
At that level, I felt uncomfortable. It actually woke me up, not the alarm, but feeling uncomfortable and sick at 10. And yet they tell people, oh, as long as you're, sort of hovering at 10 or 180, you're fine.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. The parents of, I think the parent, that's the first complication is that you feel like crap when you're high. And the parents of type 1 kids, they're not told this. So they want their kids to go out and just not even have the condition. And their way of doing that is to pretend the kids don't have the condition and then feed them birthday cake. And they look at the CGM and it's up 200 and then 300. And they say to themselves, well, we'll bring it down in a few hours, but let them be kids for now. But the parents have no idea what that feels like, and the kids are either used to it or they're not able. If you have a 2-year-old, they're not able to verbalize how terrible they feel, and after a while, terrible is the baseline, and that's the first complication. And then the next reaction amongst many of the parents is that, well, I'm going to let my kid, figure out how to eat on their own when they're older. But for now, I'm going to let them eat all the obesogenic processed food that all the other kids are eating, so that they can live a normal life. They call that normal, to overwhelm their children with junk food and run their blood glucose sky high. And the problem with that is not just that you feel terrible, but that the complications of diabetes come on a lot faster than what you're told. You say, well, the typical pushback to that is, well, my doctor said there's no problems and that the A1C is good. And that's like, you're accepting that free pass without really thinking about your child, because why are you assuming that you and your doctor have the same interests for your child? So what kind of complications can the kids run into? Well, when Dave was diagnosed, there was the beginning of an avalanche of literature on damage to the developing type 1 child brain. And you can see in the MRI studies of type 1 children that there's differentiation between the percentages of gray and white matter amongst kids who are running high blood sugars all the time. So right there's evidence that there's damage to the developing brain, right? There's morphological damage going on. And then there's a lot of other studies too. There's things like cardiac autonomopathy and there's a whole host of, so there's about 100 different diabetic complications, let's say. And your endocrinologist is not doing an exhaustive 8-hour exam on your child when he comes in to test for these complications. So if you think that you don't have complications or your kid doesn't have complications because your endo said so. They're not really doing the tests required, and a proper physical exam would last a full day. So, why would you roll the dice and just pretend that the problems aren't going to occur? Now, what about later in life? Well, later in life, we know that if you continue to run these blood sugars, you're going to have a shortened lifespan. And you say, well, it's worth it to me to, cut a few years off so that I can eat the grocery store cake and all the goodies. But you don't just get a couple years cut off. You start developing big problems. So the little problems when you're a teen become big problems in your 20s and 30s. And what kind of problems are those? I'll tell you about one problem. And you can read about these in the parents, not in the parents groups, in the type 1 groups. So if you're a parent of a young kid, I suggest you go into one of the adult groups and search for the word gastroparesis. Gastroparesis is a neuropathy of the vagus nerve. It stops you from being able to properly digest your food. A severe case of gastroparesis. So, and by the way, gastroparesis is not uncommon in type 1 children. So this is not something that you're just going to sit back and find out about 20 years from now, and maybe there'll be a cure by then. No, it comes on right away. And then as you get older, you're gonna vomit when you eat. You're gonna puke up blood. Your life is going to become miserable, and every time you eat food, you're going to be in a significant state of agony. Read the accounts of people who have this condition, and it's not an uncommon condition.
It's so common that Dr. Bernstein has a whole chapter on gastroparesis in his book. He discusses it extensively.
That's right. There's a video on gastroparesis diabetes at Diabetes University. And again, we run into problems where the gastroparesis is misdiagnosed, improperly diagnosed, and improperly treated. So he goes through all the ways that you can. So not only does he tell you how to avoid the complications, how to reverse the complications, he's also teaching you how to treat the complications, because for one thing, he worked in a diabetes wound clinic for, I think that was his pro bono work. He worked in a wound clinic on, I think, Saturdays for decades, training with one of the best diabetes wound doctors that the world had known up to that point. And, when you sit back and you listen to Dr. Bernstein's stories about what happens to people, it will, if you respond to that, and why wouldn't you? Wisdom is learning from the mistakes of others. Why wouldn't you say, hey, I'm not going to let this happen to me, rather than I don't want to hear those things. The doctor said it's okay. So, there's a weird reaction. And to be honest with you, so we've got a lot of puzzles we're putting forth, right? And for me, the light turned on once I really, and Bernstein's on top of this too. Once you start really looking at how addictive processed food is to people, then you start to understand this picture a little better. Because if this low carb Bernstein business was all about like getting rid of the sweet potatoes, and let's suppose it was green leafy vegetables that were causing all the problems, then everyone would be walking around with near normal blood sugars. But it's not that you have to get rid of the sweet potatoes. It's that you have to get rid of the chips, cookies, jellies, cakes, cereals, all those hyper palatable foods. And to me, the problem, like, if you really want to say, well, okay, let's have a debate. Let's suppose I was debating someone who said it's crazy to say that the food is addictive. My best example is type 1 parents, because they still don't get rid of the food, and yet you're measuring damage on a blood sugar meter that's done to your child on a daily basis by these foods. So what would be the reason not to get rid of those foods in your house? And the answer, I think, is that the foods have an overwhelming addictive property.
And I think from my experience, a lot of parents also realize that the whole family needs to make some changes in their in their eating habits, and they're reluctant to do so.
And why is that? Why
Exactly.
wouldn't they do it?
You mentioned it. It's the addictive side of those foods.
Well,
Um,
let me tell you about my experience doing that, because obviously when we found out like that this was the way to fix Dave's situation, and I don't even call, well, once we figured out that we had to go to low carb, it was completely obvious that we had to change everything about how we eat as a family. In fact, there's this person who's a mainstream diabetes advocate who proudly boasts that she didn't change anything about how her family eats when her son was diagnosed. And I thought when I read that, I thought, well, that's funny, because that's a great catch line for us. We changed everything about how we ate as a family to support our child's health. So then the question is like, well, why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you? Well, I did it because it was natural. Now, what was my reaction? Before that, I told you I was like a beer drinking, pizza eating slob from the Midwest. Okay. But one of the things I used to love to do every day would be have a Starbucks cookie and a coffee. That was my thing, right? I love that chocolate chip cookie from Starbucks. Loved it, really loved it, and they're really good, by the way. So now we switched over, and I'm in line at Starbucks. I took a spin class, and then I went with all the ladies to get Starbucks, and they're all eating their cookies and stuff. And I'm standing in the line, and I'm looking at the window with all the pastries in there. And it's like you could hear the chocolate chip cookie talking to you, giving you ideas about why it would be okay. And I laughed at myself, and I thought, God, I better remember this, because that was such a realization for me that the cookie had some kind of weird hold on me, right? And I found like beer was kind of the same way when I quit it, right? I felt like, well, you could just, I had this picture in my head, like, well, kicking back and having a beer, boy, that sounds good. And there was like this conversation in my head, and it's like, well, I'm trying to get healthier and lose weight. So now I'm going to stomp on the beer. So I have this internal dialogue, which is provoked by the food, right? And coming at me. And I thought I guess that's, sounds like maybe that's sort of addictive. I wasn't having any sweet potatoes coming to me saying, eat me. It was the chocolate chip cookie, that sugar fat mixture that is in a chocolate chip cookie. So I think like you can't underestimate how addictive that food is, right? Here's another example of why I think that addiction to processed food is a problem. So let's suppose you raise a child for 10 years, okay? And you go low carb, and the whole 10 years, his A1C is like 5.0% or less. And that would be Dave, right? He becomes an academic scholar. He gets into a bunch of top 50 universities. He gets scholarships. He gets scholarships for his football play. We're very proud of Dave. He's a really great, humble, sweet guy. Everybody loves Dave, and he's been really rock solid with his diabetes management, right? So you're so proud as a parent. So if you go now, let's suppose you join some diabetes group on social media, okay, not a low carb one, and you post it and you say, here's my son's success: A1C, athletics. You remove all the pushbacks. Well, he could never grow. 6'2", can throw a football through a concrete wall. You say everything. You know what's going to happen to you if you do that? You might get away with it once. If you do it twice, you're going to get thrown out of the group. And who's going to throw you out of the group? So when you join these groups, you have to look at the admins and what's going on in their lives. And so let's just say that there's a real head in the sand approach. And if you remind people that the food is addictive, the blood sugars are going to cause problems. You can get out of this problem with healthy eating and smart insulin dosing, instead of the reaction where you'd expect, where, oh my God, how did you do that? And you do get that sometimes, but the vast majority of people are not ready to leave their perch surrounded by their high carb processed foods. And so they will reject that message and you'll get pushed out of those groups.
Mm-hmm.
That's a bizarre psychological, and it's not just me, it's everybody knows that.
I can identify with that because I've been laughed at, I've been mocked in so many groups where my initial assumption was that fellow type 1 diabetics, they'll understand, they'll take interest in this.
No.
When I was new, I just discovered low carbohydrates and the effect it was having on my blood sugars. I just kept getting laughed at in every single group. And then I decided to create my own group. I didn't know about type 1 grit at the time. So I created my own group because I decided to do fasting as well. And I thought, okay, there might be some crazy type 1s out there who do fasting and who are also doing keto. And I found, I mean, there are 300 members in the private group now, 300 crazy type 1s.
Right.
We're fasting and doing keto, but wherever I would post about these things and normal blood sugars, I just get, oh, no, you're type 1. That's a very dangerous thing. We can't let this post go through. Or,
oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
I felt isolated because I wasn't getting this support from my physician. I didn't have a community. I was just all alone, just trying to figure things out. So,
yeah, the worst are there's the professional diabetes advocates, I call them. So these are people who are, they're type 1s themselves. They're paid by the industry and the associations, and they go around pretending like they represent everybody. And they use all the great words like inclusion and so on. But then they are mean as a snake when it comes to any person with diabetes who's interested in getting out the message that you can control your blood sugar to the point where you're not going to get the complications, because you're threatening their cake intake. And to them, you know, like cake is the trigger word, you know, like more proof that this is an addiction problem, because you can get more people worked up by talking about cake. That word, I'm telling you, it sets people off. You know, we have that type 1 grit page, and I posted a picture of like the grossest grocery store sheet cake. You know, they're just so gross, you know? And man, people came out of the woodwork defending their cake ability. And it's all like addictive talk, like, oh, you know, just one slice a year, you know, like, and you know, it's in moderation. They use all those words, moderation and balance, that they've been trained to you know, by their dietitian, who's probably in bad shape themselves. And you know, it's just that's the thing. Cake is just, if you want to know if someone is easily triggered, just say something like, look at this gross cake, you know. They get all defensive, you know, because the cake has control of their condition, right? And by the way, that was a great comment. I wish I would pull that up. You know, we don't have time for that. It would take me too long. But some woman said, that's not your that's the cake has a control of you. You know, you're no longer in control of your condition that the food is. And man, it was better. She said it better than I'm saying it. But that comment was so great. And if you've gone through that little chocolate chip cookie experience that I went through, boom, she nailed it. And man, she got some pushback from the people about, you know, oh, I'd rather die early than, you know, go without cake, or, you know, like absurd comments, right?
You know, I think when people mention, oh, I'd rather die, you know, or live to, the die early, they forget about the suffering, the years of sometimes
Yes.
decades of
Mhm.
suffering that you would
Yeah.
have to go through before your death. People think, oh, just one day they just go to bed and not wake up the next day. I wish we all could have a blissful death like that. But quite often people forget the suffering.
So look at it from the perspective of, okay, let's take Dave as an example. Dave is 9 years old. Okay. Uh, what does the average 9-year-old, so they're, like, let's say he's third, fourth grade, what does the next 10 years look like? Well, kids, they are studying. Why do they study? To get better, to succeed in life. What about sports? Well, they're trying to succeed in sports to, amongst other things, be good at sports and participate in a group, but also to build their bodies. Dave is no different from any other kid. He wanted to look good, but we live in Hawaii, so you're in a bathing suit half the time anyway. So he wants to look good with the shirt off, right? So all these things are and so he's going to work hard at it. They're all lifting weights. Dave played football and basketball. He never missed practices. So why are they doing all those things? Well, because they want to grow and have a prosperous adulthood. That's what kids are doing. But so that's the normal experience of a kid. Now, not all kids have the opportunities to do those things, but that's general. If you give them the opportunities, they will take them and try to better themselves. It's sort of like a human nature kind of thing, right? But yet that obvious dynamic when it comes again to the growing type 1 kids in the family is, and it's that whole, like, I'd rather die early thing is replaced by, oh, let them be kids now, kids first, diabetes second. But the experience of a kid isn't sending yourself down the tubes for some junk grocery store sheet cake. It's about building yourself to have a successful, happy adulthood. And that concept is totally ignored in the type 1 community. Like, hey, it's worth a little delayed gratification here. Do something else besides eat junk food to experience childhood. Build yourself, have fun in different ways. But that's not a mantra that's pushed by the industry. Instead, they will take the people who say kids first, diabetes second, put them on a stage with a microphone and say, cake on your birthday, right? Oh yeah, cake on my birthday. That's the message that gets out. You'll never see the mainstream diabetes industry reach out to, like, Dave, who's a well-known character right now, and say, hey, we want you to speak at our conference about your experience with normal blood glucose. They'll never do it.
I don't
Rant
think,
over.
I don't think parents are told enough of the dangers of high blood sugars. They're told about the dangers of low blood sugars. Oh no, don't, hypo's dangerous, lower figures are dangerous, right? They're warned
Yeah.
about lower figures. Some people are terrified of any figures below 5 in our measurements. I mean, below what's about
No one's more terrified than your physician's lawyer.
But they don't tell parents or even type 1, adult type 1s, about the dangers of high blood sugars. I certainly hadn't heard of those. Oh, A1C 7.8 was the lowest I could get to on a carb-based diet. I couldn't beat that. There was no way I could lower it further. And they were happy with it. No one ever told me, even at that figure with an A1C of 7.8, you are prone to developing, which I already had actually several complications, even worse complications. No one ever told me that.
Mm-hmm.
All they worry about is the hypos.
The ironic thing is that your incidence and severity of hypoglycemia is going to be dramatically different when you're on a low carb diet.
Yes.
And I don't worry about low blood sugars. So if I see Dave in the middle of the night let's suppose I wake up because I'm watching a CGM, right? He lives across the country. let's suppose Dave is 65 in the middle of the night, because low carb is not a cure for type 1 diabetes. You still have to constantly monitor your blood sugar and watch out for hypoglycemia. But let's contrast. And hypoglycemia is rightfully dangerous and should be feared. But let's contrast the kinds of hypoglycemia that Dave experiences with someone of his age group who's following a high carb diet. Dave might use for his lunch or his dinner 5-6 units of regular insulin. Regular insulin is an intermediate, slow-acting insulin, and it's used to cover protein foods. And we can get to why protein requires insulin later, but just assume that it does. Protein has a slow-acting effect on blood glucose. It's not well understood by anyone, including people in the low-carb community. But okay, you need to take insulin for it. So Dave takes his 5 units of insulin, and this is for his lettuce wrap burger. Then you have a kid who doesn't follow a low-carb diet, and they might have the same burger, but with a bun and with French fries and maybe a slice of cake. Especially, Dave's at university now, and you should see the dessert plates that they put out for the kids. And it's no wonder that everyone's going to be type 2 diabetic one day, because the food that is being served everywhere to young people is just absolutely unrestrained. The food culture is broken. Okay, but I'm not going down that road. What about the hypoglycemia? Well, who's going to have more dangerous hypoglycemia? The person who eats a hamburger with 5 units of slow-acting insulin, or the person who is covering their high-carb foods with 20 units of rapid-acting insulin? Well, first of all, the 5 units, that's going to be a pretty good guess, because it could be 4, it could be 6. Okay, let's suppose Dave's off by 1 unit. That means his blood sugar is going to be off by maybe 40 points. And if he starts at 90, the worst that could happen is eventually, after many hours, he could get down to 50, but he wears a CGM, so he'll catch it before that happens. What about the person with 20 units? Well, if Dave's off by 15%, then this person's off by 15%, and that could be 3 or 4 units. It might require 25 or 15 units. And if you're off by 4 units of rapid acting, that's a 200-point swing, which is exactly what you see in people who are eating like this. Their CGMs is constant 200-point swings, and they're going to come down like super fast, right? And they're going to need to drink a big glass of juice and maybe go straight up, or maybe they'll be stuck in the 50s. Whereas if Dave is at his 65 or 62 or 58, which is rare, if he takes a glucose tab, that's going to give him 16 points. Okay, so let's suppose he's at 65. If he has 16 points, he's back at 81. That's my blood sugar. So what is Dave walking around with? He's walking around with a few glucose tabs in his pocket, and he'll keep a liquid glucose, which is 15 grams, in his backpack. There you go. What are you using there?
Yeah, I walk around with them, just the dextrose glucose tabs. I literally walk around with this and my phone to scan my CGM and my PDM for my pump.
Yeah.
I literally go everywhere with these 3 in my hands.
Yeah, so
keys of the house don't matter, keys of the car doesn't matter, have I locked the door doesn't matter. These 3 matter most. So
you have to take your glucose. Yeah. So what I'll see during the day is I don't manage Dave's blood sugar anymore during the day, for probably since he was in like 7th grade.
Well, let's just mention Dave is 19 now, right?
Yeah, I watch him at night though, and he'll text me before he goes to bed sometimes, and he'll say, "Oh, I'm really tired, so wake me up if I worked out." So, like he'll give me some context, and I we're in a different time zone, so it's easy to watch him. So I'll watch him, and I'll wake him up. I'll call him at 3 a.m. and say, "Hey, dude, take some glucose," or "Hey, take a couple units." If you go up to like 1:30, I'll be calling him like, "Hey, wake up, take a unit." And he'll keep a loaded syringe by the side of his bed, and he'll do a unit, and he'll go back to sleep, and he'll wake up. It's all dialed in. If you're low carb, you can be very precise about these things, right? So the hypoglycemia, The bottom line is a lot of the caretakers are concerned about hypoglycemia. But if you're concerned about hypoglycemia, then it's low carb in your favor, because it's not just the levels, right? It's the amount of insulin on board and the type of insulin on board when you're experiencing those levels. So I'm not saying that Dave doesn't run sometimes in the 60s, but he doesn't run in the 60s with 10 units of insulin on board at 2 a.m. You know, he'll have like he'll be off by a unit plus or minus his whole life. And that's what he's managing. He's managing just like you, just like anybody else. You're managing that 70 to 110 range all the time. And that's why you have to lead with your glucose and your CGM, is because every 45 minutes or so, you got to look in your back pocket and go, okay, I'm 110, and you know, I think I'll do this. Now, let's talk about the quality of life that brings you. First of all, you're respectful of the hypoglycemia, but you're not in dangerous fear of hypoglycemia. But also, if you're a kid and you believe what I said earlier about kids trying to better themselves for the future, what's your attitude going to be if you're walking around with an A1C of 4.8 or 5.1? Well, you can see it on these low carb kids when they post their selfies. They pose for their A1C lab results, and their mom or dad take their pictures. So it's staged, but you can't fake the look of self-congratulations and triumph that these kids have. You cannot fake it. They know they're not going down the tubes, and they can go about the rest of their lives knowing that they're not going down the tubes. They can go do their studies. They can go do their athletics. They just have to do this extra piece of work that we need to get rid of. That should be the focus, is getting rid of that work to manage their condition. But they're not. Whereas if you're a kid and you're running an A1C of 8.5 and you're doing everything that the doctor's been telling you to, and every time you go see the doctor, they say, oh, you gotta change your ratio. And I told you, you gotta do this. And of course, none of it works, right? What's your attitude going to be? Well, if you have authority figures telling you to do things that don't work, that's the seed of rebellion. And the crazy thing is that the people accuse the low carb parents, oh, your kid's going to rebel. And kids don't rebel because they can't eat Pop-Tarts. They rebel because they're put in unworkable situations. And that's what the high carb system is. It's a system that guarantees that these kids are going to have problems, a shortened lifespan, and feel like hell all the time. And they know it. The kids are not stupid. They know that 300 is a bad blood sugar. You know, you'll see comments from parents in high carb groups like, numbers are just numbers. That's just insane. No kid is dumb enough to believe that it's just a number. They know that the meaning has actual consequences to it. Okay, that's another rant, right? But what I'm saying is the truth.
Yeah, it is.
It's true, and everyone knows it's true.
You're speaking from my heart, I have to say. You're saying all the things which I'm thinking about. I mean, talking of hypoglycemic sort of episodes, another factor about it is that, or another important part of it is that if you're sharply dropping from 300 to 65, now that is a dangerous hypo to be worried about. But if you've just dropped from, I don't know, 100 to 65, that's a completely different experience. So the experience of hypo that Dave feels or has is a completely different one from his high carb sort of dieter who's sharply dropping within an hour or two from levels of 300 to I don't know, 65. So they're not the same. We can't equate them. We can't say a hypo is a hypo. No, hypo is not a hypo. I know it from personal experience. I know actually. I know when I remember the times when I would feel hypoglycemic at levels of 120. Right, that's
Mm-hmm.
6 in our measurements. Feeling hypoglycemic because I'd just sharply dropping from, I don't know, 300 or even 400 after a pizza or pasta that no one ever told me not to eat. But that sharp drop creates that same symptoms as as hypoglycemia, even though 120 is nowhere near hypoglycemic level. So and people don't know, no one ever told me about those, the sharp drops. No one ever told me about any of that. I had to learn from Bernstein, and of course, from my own research. But this is important. So yeah, it's not actually valid to say, oh, avoid the hypos. It's what kind of hypo is your child experiencing? Because the type of
Right.
hypo also matters.
There should be a new metric, which is like a combination of your hypoglycemic blood sugar and the amount of insulin that you have on board,
Yeah.
because that's what's the real problem.
We're going to wrap this up shortly, but you did mention, so let's talk about technology that's available. You did mention, you alluded to the looping earlier on, which actually is
Yeah.
great. And if you are a low carber and you are looping, I'm seeing great successes. So it can be a helpful tool.
Sure.
But Dave is managing his diabetes perfectly without a pump. So sometimes, people say,
Yeah.
oh, you need a pump. I have a pump, but these are just devices that can make or not life easier for you. But I think primarily we all need to understand that lowering the carbohydrates is the first step, right? What's your take on the available technology?
Okay, so it's an interesting question. So I'm going to give you a preview of some interesting work that's being done in this area. And it's being done by a surprising figure. So when Dave started to transition to college, we were doing this Diabetes University on YouTube, okay? And Dave was helping me produce that. It was like a big job. So Dave was helping me organize all the questions, publish everything. And he sort of took over as the producer of Diabetes University. And that was a good college experience for him to put on his resume. And so, it was easy. Dr. B has always been really cool with my youngest son, Hayden. So Hayden took over. And Hayden's got a real mathematical bent to him, like his dad. And so Hayden did an analysis. He learned how to use a programming language called MATLAB. And he did an analysis, an implementation of Bernstein's law of small numbers. And he gave a talk at a medical conference on that. And you can find his talk online. It's called The Physics of Injected Insulin. And Hayden shows through a simple simulation why this matching thing, it's the of this much mismatch between carbs and fast acting insulin, then you have these blood sugars. And if you have this much mismatch between protein and regular, you only have this much variation. And he proved that essentially with simulation. So now I told him that he should go, and actually he got the suggestion from Professor Laniers at Harvard, like let's get some code going for the loop. And so it's real easy to turn that, it's real easy. Well, he spent some time doing that. So what is the result? The result is that if you take this simple model that he developed, you can see exactly what's being seen in the real world. There was a recent paper by, I don't know, I know Dana Lewis is one of the people on the author list, but they were boasting about the performance of the loop. And the loop is a great thing, but the blood sugars that they were getting were so bad that you're not going to see, I think you're not going to see like an average blood. You're going to see a time in range. They're hiding the in the time in range, right? They're saying, well, we improved the time in range by 8%. It's like, well, what were the blood sugars again? The blood sugars are going to be very high. And that's proof that although you might get some improvement with the loop, it's the food, right? It's the food. And what do we see in the type 1 grit community, or any low carb community? You can see it not in the grit community. We just did a survey in the grit community. What kind of blood sugars do you see from people who are looping there? You see average blood sugars in the 80s and 90s, and the standard deviation around 20 or so, right? And that's exactly what Hayden's model is producing. You're seeing the same. So really what he's doing is identifying the mechanism that is most at play. And the diabetes industry likes to hide in this phrase that there are 41 things or whatever that affect blood sugar. And that's true. But the one thing that matters the most is your carbohydrate intake. And if you remove the carbohydrate and you learn how to bolus insulin in the context of low carb, you'll have normal blood sugars. And of course, you'll have other things that affect your blood sugar too. Your monthly cycle, if you're a woman, athletics, on and on and on. Things will affect you. If you're sick, if you have a tooth infection, if you're growing, but those things can all be managed, right? The variability is really driven by the diet. And so that's my view of technology. I'm very optimistic. Bernstein has one good caveat about the pump that everyone needs to think about, which is that prolonged use of an insulin pump, in his opinion, because the needle's in you, can create some kind of inflammation and scar tissue in the body, which will eventually cause you to not be able to absorb insulin at a consistent rate. Okay, so that's his caveat. And of course, he has another good caveat, which is malfunction of mechanical devices. But if you put those things aside, I see people that are looping on low carb that have a really improved quality of life, especially at night times when they're sleeping. So Dave gets away with not having to wear this gear and all the fiddly stuff that comes along with the loop. That's a bonus. But where he suffers is at nighttime, where he has to have me watch if he really wants a good night's sleep. And then even if he's having a good night's sleep and he has a problem, I have to call him, right? And if I'm not available, then he has to watch himself, and he has to have broken sleep. The loop, in theory at least, it helps that situation dramatically. You should know when you go to bed at night, but you had the Omnipod fail, so you always have to be on your toes. But in general, you probably have a really good idea when the system is working well and your CGM has been in for a few days and it's working really well, and so it gives you that sleep benefit, which is really good. And hopefully those systems will keep improving, but the technology does not alleviate. And we know, by the way, that take people who are not type 1 diabetic, right? Food still matters. The goal of a person with type 1, let's suppose there was a cure for type 1. The goal wouldn't be to go out and develop type 2 diabetes either. The human body, let alone with injected insulin, physiologic insulin can't keep up with the kinds of foods people are trying to eat. Look around at the grocery stores, at what people have in their carts and what kind of condition they're in. You can't keep up with the kinds of foods that are being pushed, and especially not with type 1 injected insulin. And it doesn't matter what kind of tech. You see a lot of people in these conferences boasting, well, if you use a pump, we got the A1C down by 0.4%, or if you use the loop, we got our time in range was it went up from 62% to 70% or something like that. It's like, time in range is garbage. Those are really high blood sugars. Why would you even use those metrics? And we're getting back into this crazy world, crazy industry. People are in total denial. It's is that rant number 5? But I mean, there's my rant on technology. It's the food. Dave's out with his syringe and vial of insulin. And if someone gave you the option, you're gonna have to go MDI, or else you have to go back. You can keep your loop, but you got to go back to high carb. I guarantee you that the low carbers they're going to get rid of their loop, go back to MDI rather than get rid of the low carb stuff, because you can get good blood sugars just like you can with the loop on MDI. It's just a different form of work. But neither one, you're dead with blood sugars if you try to eat high carb. It doesn't matter what system you're using.
Completely. I agree. I love the technology I use, and you know, it's not anything fancy. I'm not looping, although, you know, I'm you know, I have some interest in it, but I'm not looping as yet. So, but I love. I
okay. I thought you were
back to India. I'm interested in looping, but I haven't quite reached that stage yet. So, but I'm doing fine without. In fact, I mean, in the UK, it's virtually impossible to access regular insulin, right? And I know that all the low carbers, like myself, we're managing pretty well with rapid acting insulin, not huge doses of it, but just smaller doses. For example, on my carnivore or ketovore, if you like, diet. So I monitor myself closely. That's one thing I do after a protein ingestion, and then I take smaller doses of insulin, rapid acting. What you don't want is like a massive dose of rapid acting insulin, because you're going to have a hypoglycemic effect, you know, to cover the protein. So what I do is just take smaller doses or pump smaller doses over, I don't know, perhaps 3 doses or 4 doses, 4 boluses over a period of 6 hours to cover the protein. And I'm done. So it's not impossible to manage. The key is the diet. The key is eliminating the biggest player of them all, which actually is the carbohydrates. So, so how do you what does Dave do currently with fat? How does he cover fat?
Yeah, okay. So I have a whole theory on fat. And I've gotten good data on the fat by watching Dave throughout the years do sports and grow and so on. And my basic idea is also matches what I think is physiologically correct, which is that I look at the insulin that Dave uses, the basal insulin. So he's doing about 20 units of Tresiba a day. At his peak of puberty, maybe 60, 70 units of Levemir a day. So that was a lot. But in general, I would say that the basal insulin is set to your caloric intake. Okay. So what does that mean? Let's suppose that Dave has a normal day where he goes to classes, exercises lightly, and everything's perfect. Then the next day, he does everything the same, except he increases his fat intake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So he's got maybe 700-800 calories more. Okay. What's going to happen? What's going to happen is that the basal insulin, which has been governing his lipolysis, is going to be challenged. It's going to be at the wrong rate. So I say that the basal insulin is basically modulated by your caloric intake. And so he'll need to raise his basal insulin. And you'll see that, you know, like there's a lot of growth hormone stuff at work with the teen, but there's also a dramatic increase in calorie intake that's at play with a growing teen. So what about exercise? Let's suppose, again, we have the day and Dave's perfect, and he repeats the same day, but this time instead of adding fat, he plays 2 hours of full court basketball at the gym. What's going to happen at night? He's effectively reduced his caloric intake, and so his basal insulin is too high. So what do you do in that situation with sports? And this is the genius idea. And I credit Mike Julian, Julian. You should have him on your show. He's a genius. We came up with this idea to give Dave high-fat shakes. low carb, but high fat, meaning heavy cream and some whey at night after basketball. And so you've got the high fat countering the exercise. And that seems to work well. So that's how I look at basal insulin. The bolus insulin's covering the carb and the protein and the intermediate term, and the basal insulin is governing this steady lipolysis level, which is what's happening in the human pancreas, by the way. You have basal insulin and it's governing lipolysis. And that seems to be the case in type 1s as well. You might get some low carbers mad at you who believe that only carbohydrate provokes the release of insulin. I assure you that's not the case. All macronutrients are provoking the release of insulin, whether you're type 1 or not. Well, you can see that when you fast, right? What happens when you fast? Your basal insulin's going to drop, right?
And that's why I fast when I've overindulged in fat, funnily enough, because obviously I'm not eating carbs, but when I've overindulged in fat, I notice slight insulin resistance and I fast and it's gone. I'm healed again. But it's interesting you mentioned the basal covering the fat, that I actually have several basal programs on my PDM. And one of them is, for days I am not eating much fat. So I actually called it no fat day. So it's like, or low fat day. So because I'm not eating fat, I actually require less basal insulin. So, and I moderate the fat, not because I'm terrified of, fat, because I actually notice fat gain. I don't want to talk of weight.
Okay, so what's going to happen if you and I sit down with some endocrinologists and explain that, and we also explain why protein needs insulin? What's going to happen? Are you going to get a lot of like, tell me more, that's really interesting, or are you going to get indifference at best? And that's again, we go back to the puzzle, right? But you've got it. You've got to have these different you've got to anticipate, because and with Tresiba it's the same way, right? We would do a very similar example to what you've got. So during basketball season, the insulin sensitivity is so great, your basal insulin might go down by like half. Okay. Now, what happens on Sunday? Saturday, you didn't practice, and Sunday, you're just sitting at home playing Xbox all day. What's going to happen? Your insulin sensitivity is going to go away. Plus, you're going to be eating more because you're just sitting around. And so what we would do on Sunday morning for the Sunday morning Tresiba dose is I would go, if it was 10, I would give 12 because I knew what was going to happen. So understanding now, if you're on a high carb diet, you'll never be able to dial in your amount of fat. The whole thing is so much nonsense. But the beauty of the low carb is we can do just exactly what you're talking about. We can figure out all those other 40, like I said, they try to tell you like it's impossible. There's so many factors, forget about it. But if you get rid of the carbohydrate, then like, oh, I have a little toothache and my blood sugar is running high. Got it, right? Or it's my time of the month, or I exercise, or all these other things, right? You can take them into account. I didn't sleep well, so right. But if you're eating carbohydrate, there's too much random chaos in the system, and it's like hopeless, right? The best you can do is shoot for 180, right? Another rant.
What a wonderful, rant. What a wonderful conversation this was. I could talk to you for another hour. However, we have to wrap this up. I can't thank you enough for your time and for your passion and for all the good work you're doing for the low carb type 1 community. I really appreciate your group and all your posts. I will put all the links below so you can go and support RD. Once again, thank you very much. Now we've got to bring Dave on the channel too. David, when he has time.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Bye for now. Bye bye.
Bye.